All right, everybody, welcome to class tonight. Thank you for accommodating the crazy schedule. I think we moved this because of gospel meeting at South Florida Avenue, and so we're a little bit off, but I'm glad to be back with you. I missed class last month. So tonight we're going to go through chapter 8 in our book, Portrait of God. And it's actually quite a long chapter, so we'll see how far we get. I'm going to try to finish it up, but there's a lot to talk about. And this, to me, was the first chapter where I didn't feel like I could easily read the whole passage. It was Numbers 15 all the way through Deuteronomy. So that's a lot of text to get through. But I'm sure that you're familiar with some of the passages, and we'll hit the highlights as we go through. So this is covering the period of the wilderness wanderings. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. And why was it a 40-year journey from Egypt into the land of Canaan? You're all muted. I guess I can't ask questions.
No,
No, it was not.
it should not have taken that long.
That's right. It should not have taken that long. It was more like a matter of weeks, probably, if you just made your way forward. But they were in the wilderness, and we say it, right? Wandering, you're wandering in the wilderness. So they were really, God had shown them at the last passage we read, which was the spies going into the land. That was in Numbers 14 or 13, Numbers 13. And then in Numbers 14, they were actually afraid to enter the land, and they were chastised for that. They were rebuked for that. And, God's saying to Moses, why don't the people believe me? And so we talked about that last time, that here they have all this evidence, and the spies went in, and there were 2 faithful spies, but the spies that came back and said, no, we can't do it, they really convinced the heart of the people that they couldn't do it. But by the end of that chapter, you see that they had tried to make an unauthorized attempt to go into the land, and they decided they could just do it by themselves. Moses told them, don't do it, but they were defeated. And so here we are in chapter 15, and we sort of take a pause from the action. And here in chapter 15, God is setting up some laws for the people in terms of the offerings that they need to make. And so here we have in Numbers 15 some principles of redemption. And this is where we're going to start to see how serious God is about not just the commands that he's giving them in the wilderness, and not just their process of getting into Canaan, but also about consecrating themselves and listening to what he's saying. And really, he's serious about obedience and disobedience. So that's the theme of this chapter. Those 40 years in the wilderness, you're seeing the consequences of disobedience and a lack of faith. So this 40 years, it begins with God setting out the laws, and he goes through the laws of purification. We'll get into some of the details here in a minute, but there's almost maybe a controversial, that might not be the word, not controversial, but in an incongruous statement here that's made. And it's talking about, in the book on page 87, this is the sentence. It says, the sacrificial system, so the old law basically, was an expression of God's love, grace, and goodness in providing a means for man's atonement and entrance into his holy presence. And so he goes on and talks about kind of some of the processes and the things that they were required to do and the sacrifices that they were making. But let me ask, and you might need to unmute, but let me ask your thoughts about that statement. To me, that stuck out as kind of a funny statement, because I don't think we usually think of the Old Testament system as a system of grace and love. Do we? What do we usually think of the old law as?
Strict.
Yeah, strict, right? I mean, sometimes people even think that it's a different God, right? Oh, God of the Old Testament was mean and, took vengeance on people. And here's this God of the New Testament. All of a sudden, he's about grace and love. And I think, students of the Bible know that that's not really true, right? That's the same God. And of course, that's part of a singular plan. But I think it's hard for us to see sometimes God's grace and love in the old law. But that's really what this section is about. And I think he says it there. The sacrificial system was an expression of God's love, grace, and goodness. And he says it by providing this means for man's atonement and entrance into his presence. So when you think about it that way, God's setting up this sacrificial system and the laws of purity and cleansing, and then what the priesthood was supposed to do, bringing all the sacrifices before God. That system is, that's a very detailed and very strict, the word was strict, way for man to approach God. And I guess, as thinking about this for the last 6 weeks or so, when you think about the New Testament system, it really is just as detailed and required also a sacrifice. It's just that the sacrifice wasn't ours. And it was, in Hebrews, we hear, like, how many times did Jesus have to sacrifice himself? Right? Once for all. And so it was much more efficient, but the price that was paid is the same. And so I think it's helpful for us to think about that sometimes. In the New Testament, the sacrifice was made for us, and even in Hebrews, it talks about this. How much more then should we be thankful for God's allowing us to draw near him without having to go through all of the exercises that they did in the old law, because Jesus did all that for us. And so the gratefulness that we have in Hebrews 4, it says we can approach the throne of grace boldly and come for help in time of need, grace in time of need. That privilege should not be taken lightly. So even in the Old Testament, it was God making a way for us, for the people then, to come near to him. And he had very specific requirements. So we just started, for those of you who joined a little later, Olivia and Stacy and I were talking a little bit about instrumental music and, God's system of New Testament worship. And without going into that whole topic, the specifics of what God requires in worship, it's the same God as it was in the Old Testament. So he was very specific about what he wanted in the Old Testament. And I would argue that he's also pretty specific about what he wants in the New Testament too. And we'd be wise to consider that it is the same God, and not to take lightly that maybe we don't feel the effects of disobedience quite as immediately as they did in the passages we're going to look at tonight. So one of those is the penalty for disobeying the Sabbath. And so if you want to look in your Bibles at Numbers chapter 15, we're going to look at a couple of these specific examples of people transgressing God's law here. And, he does, in the chapter, he does talk about something that we've covered quite a bit just in these early chapters of this book. And that is this group of people. Think about all the things they had witnessed God doing, right? They had been led out of Egypt. They saw the death of the firstborn. They saw the crossing of the Red Sea. They've seen manna fall from heaven. They've seen quail provided for them, water coming from rocks. Like there's some really powerful, miraculous intervention that God was doing for them on a regular basis while they're out in the wilderness. And despite all of that, they still are viewing God's law as like, well, maybe it's not that important. So let's look at one of them in Numbers chapter 15.
Where you go?
Let's start in verse 32. And this is right after God gives the laws of grain and drink offerings, and then he's also made a law concerning unintentional sin. So if you sin unintentionally, there's still sacrifices required, right? He just goes through all of that. And then in verse 32, it says this: Now, while the children of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him under guard because it had not been explained what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man must surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." So, as the Lord commanded Moses, all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died. So, react to that for a minute. What's your thinking there? What was he doing? He's out on the Sabbath day, gathering sticks.
And six.
Deserving of death? I think that's hard for us to grapple with, right?
I certainly hope not.
Yeah, I mean, this seems like maybe a minor thing, but
if they get away with the minor things, then what happens when the big things come along?
Yeah, well, there's
like, oh, it's okay. It's just
big sin and a little sin.
Yeah. Is it a big sin or is it a little sin? Tony, you're saying something, but you're muted, I think. Are you having trouble connecting? Yeah, sorry. You can type it in the chat, baby. We can try to get you by chat if you want. Yeah, well, there's more to it, I think, than just that it seems like a minor infraction. Because what law was he violating? Was it the law that says don't pick up sticks?
Disobedient on the Sabbath when they were
Yes.
told specifically what they should do on the Sabbath day.
There you go. All right, so this is actually, this was not a minor infraction. This is actually taking the day that God had deemed holy, the one day, and saying, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to anyway. So it wasn't just the act of picking up sticks. And I think this is an important thing for us to think about, right? Sometimes, we just said, oh, it's just a little thing, or it's a little sin. And maybe we don't really think this way, but let's not think this way. That, what's the principle that we're violating when it seems like something that's sort of minor? Oh, it's just a little lie. Well, you're violating the very nature of God, who can't lie, right? And you're participating with Satan, the father of lies. So it's not just a little lie. It's a big deal. And I think that's sort of the message. There's two messages, I think, out of this, but one is the law that God gave in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 commandments, had the first section, those first 4 commandments are really about God and treating him as holy and recognizing his sovereignty. That's what the first 4 commandments are about. The other 6 commandments are about, because of God's person, now this is how you treat the rest of your fellow man. And so that's really the break of the 10 commandments. But that 4th commandment of keeping the Sabbath is part of who God is, right? It's really, all of that is springing from God's nature. And he set aside this day to be holy because of the way he did the creation, right? He stopped working on the 7th day, and so you will too. So this is not a minor infraction. This is actually one of the core principles that God set up. And interestingly, it doesn't do God a lot of good for people not to work on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day was made for man, right? It was to protect man. And so here's this person going out, and it's interesting that the congregation here finds him, and they don't really know what to do with him, right? We haven't been given instruction yet about what to do with someone who breaks the Sabbath, and so they lock him up, and they go to Moses and Aaron. And so God gives Moses instruction, and this is a severe penalty. And interestingly, who issues the punishment here? Does God strike him dead?
As the people do it.
Yeah. So there's a few lessons here, right? This reminds me of, I don't know where it's written. I should have written the reference down. I'm sorry, but this reminds me of the place where it talks about the congregation noticing someone who's being disobedient to parents a child being disobedient to his parents. And the punishment was the same. Take that child and stone him. And that's horrible to us. But here's the thing. The fact that that's the punishment, you better believe makes the parents care, the kid care, and the whole community care. Nobody wants to go do that, right? So you're going to do everything in your power to make sure that that kid obeys his parents. And that's the power of this kind of punishment. This is designed so that the congregation would enforce keeping of the Sabbath day. Like, you got to teach it, you've got to make plans for it, you've got to make sure that everybody knows that it's not going to be tolerated. And so putting that punishment in the hands of the people feels really harsh, but it drove home the point that you cannot tolerate violating God's law. You just can't tolerate it. It's not going to be a peaceful society if you tolerate that. So I think that sounds really, I mean, I'll just speak for myself, right? That's harsh that somebody was stoned for that. But I think if you recognize what law was being violated, and then what maybe the wisdom in the punishment that was issued as prevention, I think that you can think of it maybe in a different way. We don't experience punishment like that today, right? An immediate or a community like stoning somebody. But there is church discipline in the New Testament where we are to watch for each other and help each other. And it talks about, reaching out to somebody, watching yourself so that you don't be tempted, but get them back on the path, right? We're supposed to be doing that for each other. So there's this accountability that's baked in to this punishment. There's another one in chapter 16, and we'll look at this one as well. In chapter 16, this is the rebellion of Korah. So Korah, we don't know much about Korah here other than that. I'll read it. I'll do 16, 1-3, short passage. It says, now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses with some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? And I'll keep going. When Moses heard it, he fell on his face and spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will cause him to come near him. So it goes on. The rest of the chapter here talks about Korah. Can anybody remember what happened? Anybody know this one?
Ground split and ate them.
Yeah. Yep. So here we have this, they have this almost ceremony where they call all of the 250 men before the Lord. And Moses basically says, let's each give an offering and the Lord will make a decision. And so it says in verse 15, Moses was very angry about this, right? Moses knew who had been chosen to lead. And in fact, he had suffered quite a bit for it, right? They'd already spoken against him. He had to get his brother back in line, like he'd been leading them. He was tired. And he knew he was doing the work that God wanted him to do. And so it made him very angry. So he prays and says, don't respect their offering and so on. So yes, the ground opens up and swallows them and they're punished. And so here we have another situation where, it doesn't, what was their sin? What did they do here?
They challenged the person that God put in charge.
Yeah. All right. So we talked about this a little bit last month, and you said that perfectly, Olivia. They challenged the person.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. You said it perfect, Stacy. You sound alike.
We sound exactly the same.
You do.
Happens all the time.
Sorry. So Stacy, perfect. That was exactly, I think, what the message was here. That here's Moses, and it was Moses and Aaron, not just Moses, but Moses and Aaron. And here these people come, and it's interesting what that, how they say it. Oh, you're taking too much on yourselves. All of us are holy. We're all God's children. And so, why are you taking the leadership position? Why are you in charge? Why are you exalting yourself? So the lesson here, I think, is there are a number, but what struck me about this is what these people were doing is questioning not Moses' authority, but God's authority. And so God had appointed Moses and Aaron, and the people knew. I mean, God had spoken that this is my mouthpiece. Aaron is going to do the speaking. He had shown through signs that Moses and Aaron were the appointed ones. Moses and Aaron had been given miraculous powers in certain cases, right? Getting water out of rocks and so forth. And so there was a lot of evidence that Moses and Aaron were the leaders. And here we have this group of people that just decides we're going to challenge it. And it says, the one little word in there, they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And so, the message of recognizing who it is that God has put in authority, and then the idea of questioning those people. Now, give me some examples of who God has put in positions of authority in our lives.
Elders.
Elders, great.
Deacons as well.
The minister.
Sorry, say it again. I can't hear you very well. Say it again.
I was saying the elders, the deacons, the minister.
Yep.
Our husbands.
Men's. There's one more that I can think of. Maybe two more.
Or government.
Government. Great.
Police. Yeah.
Yep. Agents of the government. And maybe you could also think about your employer too, right? I mean,
Yes.
how you put that, but places where people have authority. And I mean, I will say this, it is important for us to, Acts 5:29, we ought to obey God rather than men. So we ought to discern whether the people who have authority are acting within God's authority, right? So we don't want to ever obey blindly. We want to make sure that we're also discerning for ourselves whether they're asking us to do something that is against God's will. So with that caveat, I'll say it's really critical that we're not questioning their authority, right? If this is the lesson from...
Doesn't that also include parents though?
Yes, parents, thank you. Yes. Parents is another one. Absolutely. Yep. Parents, where parents have authority. So it's an important concept here, not to question the authority that they have, and to be submissive in your spirit. And it's, again, something that's easier said than done. But we looked at that last time a little bit when we talked about Miriam. So, okay, comments on those two examples, and then we'll move forward. We've said it all. So I liked the way on page 88, kind of going back to the Sabbath person, there's a nice statement, the way it's said on page 88 that I underlined. It says, God's grace is not coercive. It entreats, but it does not intrude. It pleads, but it does not push. It implores, but it does not impel. Appropriating the blessings of grace is wholly dependent on the obedience of faith. The man who profaned the Sabbath day demonstrated his irreverence toward God and his contempt for the will of God. He surely knew the will of God relative to the decorous behavior on the Sabbath day. He had obviously developed a so what disposition regarding divine authority and exhibited that spirit by supplanting God's will with his own. So that's sort of the upshot here, that when God puts somebody in authority or creates sets forth a law, then when we don't recognize that, we're really saying, I don't really care about God's authority. That's really what we're doing. And so even though it might seem minor to us, or it might seem minor to those that we're talking to, it's not. I made the note in my book, God is pretty serious here, right? God is really serious.
Hey, Susan.
Yeah.
I was thinking, you talked about how people think that, there was two different gods almost, because the God of the Old Testament was so harsh, and, the God of the New Testament just seems more, la, 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 la. But
Yeah.
I look at it this way, back in the Old Testament, God, he was very, very present, not physically exactly, but he spoke to people, he interacted with people. He was very, very much more present in their lives, and which I think made him look more harsh, but that was in looking forward to the time that we're in now. He does not specifically interact with us through other people right now. We only have his word. So I think it just makes it seem like he was more harsh, but I think he did that on purpose, because he knew there was going to get to be a point where we would not have him, looking at us with that mom face per se. We have to go strictly by what he left written down for us. And that's not always as
direct, maybe.
I want to be impactful, but that's not what I mean. I mean, it's when your mom or whoever is looking at you and giving you that death look, it's a lot different.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that's part of it for sure. Now we have the guide of the written word. And I guess, I've had conversations like that with people that they think this God of the Old Testament is this terror. And I think, it's not so much that God has lost his harshness. It's that it's harder to recognize his love and grace in the Old Testament. I think if you really read the Old Testament, you can see that it's the same God. He made all these ways for them to be with him. He took care of them. He took Lot by the hand and took him, like, he really, in a very direct way, where it's more indirect now, maybe that might not be the right word either, but I think it's harder to see the love and grace that God had, but he did in the Old Testament. So if you focus more on that with people, you can actually see in the Old Testament that it is the same God. And he is as severe, right? Behold the goodness and severity of God. I just think I don't know if people don't want to see it, or
when we don't get punished right away, it locks into a sense of false security.
Yeah.
Because it's like nothing happened. I just did. Nothing happened. Well,
but it makes it more scarier in a sense that it is written, basically what is going to happen. And I guess that's where grace and mercy comes in. He's saying, okay, we are closer to the end now.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we need to take it seriously. See, this is how we handled the children of Israel back then.
Yeah.
So if he did that with them, what is going to happen to us if we don't obey and we die in our sins? I don't know if I explained.
Yeah.
Makes sense the way I said it, but
I think you did. I think, there is an example in the New Testament where there was punishment by death. Right?
and Ananias and
Yeah.
Sapphira.
Same sort of situation, right? It seems like, nobody even knew, and it might seem minor, but, God right away intervened. I mean, this was the time when God acted directly, right? This is the time of miracles and, God sort of acting in a more immediate, maybe that's the word. I don't know. We're all struggling with that word, but, so it's not just an Old Testament God that did that. He did punish by death in the New Testament, but the difference is maybe, like Ingrid is saying, the punishment of physical death is one thing. The The punishment of spiritual death is something else altogether, permanent spiritual separation from God. And so God has given us a little bit of a longer time period and a little bit of a longer, I don't know, he's given us solid written instruction, and then grace and mercy, and then time to work it out. And so, because your punishment is so much more final in the New Testament.
Question just occurred to me. There wasn't as much as a emphasis in the old about the spiritual death and separation like it is now under the new law. Am I correct? I'm trying to think where I've seen it.
Maybe not as
Spelled out as much as
explicit.
Right.
Yeah, but I think
Like
they
it
did
is
understand
now.
it. Like you can see, like even some of what Rahab said, I think you can see that they did know that it had eternal consequences.
Mhm.
But yeah, it maybe wasn't as explicit that it was spiritual death rather than physical death.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other comments? I'm watching the clock. We'll try to keep going. So one of the things that's introduced in chapter 18, if you want to turn over there, is the idea of purification. And we have, I'm sorry, it's chapter 19. So there's this formula given for purification, and it's the whole chapter, really. There's sacrifice, there's certain types of wood and plants and scarlet, and you take the ashes, you burn all that and take the ashes, and then you mix those ashes with water, and that makes a purifying liquid. And so you sprinkle the water onto whatever you want to purify, and that makes it clean. So, what's interesting, I think, about this is when you look at all of the ingredients of what's put into that water, those are things we actually know today that have antiseptic or antibacterial properties. So it's interesting that, back then it really did purify from physical germs. But more importantly, what the image here is this idea that you needed to be washed and cleansed and purified in order to approach God. And it was both for the priests, they went through a purification ritual, and then anything else that was brought before God or any other person in the assembly, they were sprinkled with this water. And so this is, one of the first times that we're seeing this idea that water, it has a purifying effect. And, not just that we need to be washed with water, but again, pointing to the nature of God, that because of our sin, we can't come near to God unless we're purified. And you can, of course, see the parallels there to New Testament baptism. But again, it's a comment more on the nature of God than it is on requirements on us here, because God can, in order for God to associate with man, there has to be some sort of purification. So that principle I thought was interesting, kind of right here in chapter 19, as we're kind of looking at all these instances of disobedience while they're wandering in the wilderness. And then we get to chapter 20, which is one of the saddest events in the Old Testament. And that is where Moses makes my Bible says it's an error. I don't know if I would say it's an error. He sins. What does Moses do in his sin? Yeah, so he was told, and there are a couple things here about this chapter. The Lord spoke to Moses in verse 7, chapter 20, verse 7. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him. So far, so good. Verse 10, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not, here's that word again. What does it say in verse 12? Anybody reading along?
Believe me.
Believe me. Because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. So a couple things going on here, right? He specifically disobeyed. He was told to speak, he struck. He also, God said, you didn't believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. So, God wanted the credit for bringing the water from the rock. And Moses says to them, must we bring water from the rock for you? So he's almost taking God's credit here as well. So this incident, again, kind of Moses in a fit of temper or out of anger or, just frustration. I mean, I'm not trying to make an excuse, but I'm imagining his emotional state was, in some state of anger, that he carries out this act in direct conflict with what God asks of him. And again, here we have the punishment that seems so extreme. So what's the punishment for Moses taking those actions?
Can't
He
go
did
in.
not make it into the promised land.
Yep. You're not going in, right? You're not going to go into the land. You're not going to lead the people. It says, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. And so there's a section here where Moses asks several times, could you remove this from me? And I think way into Deuteronomy, God says, don't ask me again. You're not going. And, so this is, again, here we have, of all the people in all the world accused of unbelief, right? Could Moses actually have not believed in God? It's a real
He
question.
allowed his human emotion to get in the way.
Yeah.
Maybe he just got a little too comfortable or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, this parallels us today, though, too, because he did not do like God told him to do, and he didn't go into the promised land. If we don't do things the way God told us to do it, we're not going into our promised land.
Yep.
It's
Beautiful
the same thing.
There's the parallel right there. It's almost that simple, right? It seems harsh that God withheld, here he was leading the people, and he kept leading. Like he wasn't demoted after this incident. He kept going. And, he came right up to the edge. And in fact, God did let him look in, right? Took him up on a mountain and let him look. But he was not permitted to go in. And so that's the very point, is what Stacy just said. That was Stacy, right?
Yeah. But now did the people, my question is, and I don't know if it says anything about this, because my thought would be that this would be just another thing to show the people, look, you better do what God says, how he says it, because look what happened to Moses. But was that conversation strictly between Moses and God, or did the people know that, hey, Moses didn't get to go in because he did this?
I think they did know, because, and I'd have to double check that. In fact, let me double check that, because here's the thing. They do know that Joshua will be named. So they know at some point that there's a plan to replace Moses. That's a good question. Did they know specifically why? We can look at that, unless anybody on the call knows right away.
But Susan, this is one of those instances also where when people talk about the strictness of the Old Testament, God showed mercy to Moses. Because Moses could have been stoned just like the rest of the people.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, there's so many lessons in the Moses example here that yes, God did show mercy. And in fact, he let Moses ask him, I think it was 3 times, it was at least a couple of times. And finally he said, stop asking me. But he did let him look. And he did, Joshua had been sort of by Moses's side way back in Exodus 20. Joshua was there as Moses was getting the tablets. He was kind of in the background. He was probably very young. But the idea that Joshua would be raised up as a successor to Moses was also merciful, right? They got a new leader that knew them and that understood all the history. And, there are lots of places where God was merciful here. But, it does come down to what was said earlier about, the promised land was, and I mean, even the way God says it, the land which I have given them, like that was a done deal. God already gave them that land, right? We talked about that last month too. They had to just go and take it the way that God asked them to do it. So there was all kinds of mercy and grace here, even in Moses's disobedience. But, God as a just God couldn't let him go in. So yeah, it's a big lesson not just to those people, but especially to us. And it always has made me sad, right? When you read this, even as a kid, as I would read this, like, man, poor Moses, Moses was the leader and he wanted to go there. So anyway, there's a point here on page 93 of our book that it says, this tragic event points once again to the character of God, the immutable nature of his word, that means unchangeable nature of his word, something for us in the New Testament, right? Old Testament, same as New Testament, that God's word cannot be changed or overturned. The deplorable nature of sin and its grievous consequences, and man's inability, regardless of his spiritual stature, to furnish a cure. Right? You're dependent on God for his mercy and his grace to get into the promised land. It says Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth, Numbers 12, verse 3. He was the one through whom the law was given, John 1:17. A prophet like Christ, Deuteronomy 18. It goes on. But the depth of Moses' spirituality and his unique relationship with God could not cancel out his transgression or function as a surrogate for his human weakness. So that's a long paragraph there, but it's well said, right? That this really does point to the nature of God, that God's will is, again, I'm going to use the word serious. It's serious. So all of the New Testament that's given for us, we should treat just as serious as the Old Testament law. It's not the same law. It's a different law. And Hebrews tells us it's a better law. But it's the same God, and it has the same seriousness and the same consequences. There's no little tiny sin, right? And there's no person who's above it, right? Nobody's above the law. Even Moses himself wasn't above God's law. Okay. Just in the interest of time, we're going to move forward. I'm going to skip through Balaam, although I will mention Balaam and Balak. We won't go through the account there in Numbers 22, but really, turn to just one verse, Numbers 22, verse 18. And this is, again, the theme here. There's just another example where God's driving home this point. Numbers 22, verse 18. Says this, then Balaam answered and said to the servants of Balak. So Balaam is asked to, well, we won't go through it. Let me just read it. Though Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go beyond the word of the Lord my God to do less or more. And so here we have Balaam kind of holding firm on the prophecy that God had given him. And it was not a pleasant prophecy. And he was being paid and offered all kinds of things in order to change the prophecy. And he's like, nope, I can't go beyond the word. And so that's the theme here, right? God's word is sovereign. And, no matter what happened with Balaam and his donkey and all of the other things, he was not going to change that prophecy. So that's the message, I think, of chapter 22 and 23.
That reminded me of Revelation. Don't remember the chapter and verse where it talks about adding to or taking away from the
Yes.
words of the book
Yep.
of the law. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not trivial that that's one of the last verses in the Bible, right? That
Yeah.
like all this word that's written, by the way, don't touch it.
Yeah.
So it's critical. Yeah, good point. Let's turn over in the last few minutes to the book of Deuteronomy, maybe page 96 and following in your book. And, in Deuteronomy, what does the word Deuteronomy mean? Somebody know?
Second
A
law
little. It means the second law.
of the law.
The second law or the re-giving of the law. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses is, we're nearing the end, right? Moses comes to the end here at the end of Deuteronomy. And it's really, the book refers to it as Moses' final sermon. I mean, it's certainly not all a sermon, but there's a lot of Moses talking to the people. And again, he knows he's going to send these people into the land of Canaan without him. And of course, at the end of this book, all of that generation also dies, but the younger generation here is going to take forward and go in. So he's really, and here's the lesson here. This is the book where Moses is saying, hey, tell your children. So turn over, if you will, to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And you know this passage, but this is the context of this passage. So here's Moses. He tells them about obedience. He tells them, beware of idols. He tells them they're going to face things in the land of Canaan that they don't have to face in the wilderness. It's going to be different for them. They're going to be challenged by all these other nations around them, and they need to stand firm and know the law and know the law and know the law. And so he reviews for them in chapter 5 all of the 10 commandments. Like, let's go over it again. And then in chapter 6, we get to a passage that I know everybody's familiar with, but let's read it. Let's just read verse 1 through 6. It's short. Now, this is the command. This is 6, Deuteronomy 6. Now, this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you may observe them in the land which you're crossing over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, you and your son and your grandson. There's where he knows that this generation is not going, right? You teach your children, you and your son and your grandson, all the days of your life, and that your days may be prolonged. Therefore, hear, O Israel, and be careful to observe it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord God of your fathers has promised you, a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand. They shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gate. I know you know that passage, but so this is where he's telling them to put these words in your heart, memorize them, right? Write them on your heart and teach them diligently to your children. We talk a lot about this in parenting. How often do you talk about God around your kids?
Chance you get.
Every chance you get. This talks about every single time of day, anything you're doing, right? How important is it? Well, diligently. You're going to teach them diligently, your children, when you sit, when you walk, when you lie down, when you rise up. That's any time during the day. It's important to have God as part of the day with your children, and also all over yourself, right? Like it's bound on your hand, like it's between your eyes. Have it present, always present, and write them on the doorposts of your gates. And I know we do that, right? We put Bible words sometimes on plaques in our houses, and it's important. Those things are important. And so this is Moses warning them, right? Your children need to understand what's been happening. They need to understand that God gave a law, and you've got to keep that law. So you can see all the parallels into the New Testament. I won't hammer that home, but this is what Deuteronomy is. This is Moses saying, hey, remember all this. Somewhere in the book, it talks about the words, the themes, the key. Yeah, I'm sorry, on page 98, it says keywords in the book of Deuteronomy are remember and its companion, get not. So that's throughout the book of Deuteronomy, Moses reminding them, don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. It's important. So let's finish up with, and we missed a lot of Deuteronomy. I underlined quite a bit in the chapter, and I'll just mention a couple of things before we finish out. Page 97, go back a page. That there's a paragraph here about God's, I underlined this sentence at the end of the first full paragraph. It says, therefore, God's law is for man's good. I think that's a great teaching tool. If you're talking with someone who, doesn't understand why God cares what we do, or, why would God make these laws that seem arbitrary to people who don't understand them? I think that's a really important point, right? Every law that God gave is for our own good. It's either to protect us here on earth or it's to get us to heaven. And so there's a nice paragraph there that I won't read. And then the next paragraph, I also made an underline about God arrays himself in opposition to that which is for his own good. So he's talking about when people reject the only means available to them in order to be faithful, that, God has no choice in that. I mean, he does have a choice, but he's given us that choice. God has granted us that choice, that if we choose not to take advantage of the means of achieving grace and salvation, then he lets us do it, right? He's given us that choice. So in the last moment, let's just talk in the last section here of the book, it talks about Abraham's faith versus Abraham's blood. And there was a good question posed in the study questions at the back of the chapter. Question 14 said, why did the descendants of Abraham consider themselves special? Why did they? What did they think about themselves as children of Abraham?
Well, they were the chosen ones.
Yeah. And like by virtue of the family that they were a part of, they thought that they had it made, right? And the section that's here mentions that Deuteronomy actually settles this idea. Who is special in the eyes of God? It's not so much having Abraham's blood in your veins, but having the what of Abraham?
The faith.
The faith of Abraham. It's having the faith of Abraham. And so there's, a lot of passages in Romans, especially talk about the faith of Abraham. We read about the faith of Abraham in Hebrews 11, but, Jesus talked about having, sorry, it wasn't Jesus. It was John the Baptist talked about God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones, right? It doesn't really matter what family you're a part of. What matters is, were you faithful like Abraham was? And so Abraham's faith was held out as an example here.
You know what?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we can use that along with, I guess, in Christianity, because some people think, well, my mama was this, my daddy was this. So, it's in my blood. Some of the children of Israel took it for granted because they were descendants.
Yep.
That, they were okay no matter what they did, by virtue of being a direct descendant. I'm good, God got me and I can do no wrong. And some Christians, or some who say they're Christian, act the same way, like the ones who say you can never lose, once you're saved, you can never lose it. You're always in God's good grace.
Yeah.
And that's not true. Look at poor Moses.
Yep. That's right. Look at Moses.
Moses, just one slip up
Right.
and he didn't make it into the promised land.
Right.
And that can happen to us.
That's right. Yeah.
You
And
know?
I think of this too as, even being a part of a congregation that's very active. Sometimes you can find yourself, here, I'll speak for myself again. Sometimes, and maybe it's pride, right? Where you think like, oh, the congregation that I attend does all these great things. And, you don't get credit for that as an individual unless you're also participating in all of those things, right? I mean, it's great that the congregation is active, and I'm not saying you have to do every single thing, like every act of every congregation has to be, some people have different strengths and different abilities, but yeah, you can get lulled into thinking that because of my environment or because of my family or because of my history or because whatever, that oh, I'm good. I don't have to think about this anymore. But yeah, even Moses, and the point of this, the bringing up Abraham here is it really was, if they had followed in Abraham's footsteps, this book would be very different, right? You wouldn't have 600,000 dying off in the wilderness. You would have had them going into the promised land. And so, it's a serious, again, the word serious keeps coming up. It's a serious lesson to think about the obedience that God requires. And I guess I should say, for the benefit of those listening, especially online later, that, this doesn't nullify the grace of God. I think what this does is it points to the grace of God, right? God made provision for us to be with him through faith and obedience by his grace. So it doesn't mean, Romans 6 says, should we sin that grace may abound? Right? It's not a license to sin. So I think that's the message of Deuteronomy. So, all right, we're over time. We'll stop there. I really appreciate you all being online.